The racial chemical warfare experiments. Deep within the classified archives of the Pentagon lies documentation of one of the most disturbing and systematically concealed programs in American military history. During World War II, the United States military conducted extensive chemical warfare experiments on its own troops, but with a horrifying twist that remained hidden for over 50 years. These tests deliberately segregated soldiers by race to determine how chemical weapons affected different ethnic groups. Sergeant James Edwards, an African-American soldier, was among 60,000 enlisted men enrolled in a once-secret government program formally declassified only in 1993. But Edwards was chosen for a specific and chilling reason. Military officials explicitly told test subjects that they were being used to determine what effects chemical agents would have on black skin compared to white skin. The experiments were conducted at multiple facilities across the United States, with the most extensive testing occurring at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Soldiers were exposed to mustard gas, lewisite, and other chemical agents without their informed consent. They were told they were participating in tests for protective clothing or general military research, never knowing they had been selected based on their racial background. What makes this program particularly insidious is the systematic nature of its concealment. All World War II chemical experiments were conducted in complete secrecy and were never recorded on subjects' official military records. Participants received no follow-up medical care or health monitoring of any kind. They were sworn to absolute secrecy about the tests under threat of dishonorable discharge and military prison time. This deliberate secrecy meant that many veterans were unable to receive adequate medical treatment for their injuries because they could not tell doctors what had been done to them. Decades later, when some details finally emerged, military officials acknowledged the existence of chemical testing, but never publicly discussed the racial segregation component until investigative journalists forced the issue into the open. The program extended beyond American soil to foreign locations specifically chosen to avoid domestic oversight. The San Jose Project conducted chemical warfare experiments on a remote Panamanian island, where researchers exposed Japanese American and white soldiers to mustard and lewisite agents over the course of 20 days. The island was selected for its climate, which resembled Pacific theater conditions, but also because it allowed military officials to conduct experiments away from any possibility of American public scrutiny. Project X-ray and biological warfare. Among the most bizarre and tightly classified American military projects was an attempt to weaponize animals for incendiary attacks against Japanese cities. Project X-ray represented a convergence of biological warfare research and unconventional military thinking that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in warfare. Initiated in 1942, the project involved capturing millions of bats from caves across New Mexico and attaching small incendiary devices to them. The plan was elegantly simple and terrifyingly effective. Bats would be released over Japanese cities during daylight hours, where they would instinctively seek dark places to roost. Buildings, attics, and other structures would provide perfect hiding spots. When the incendiary devices detonated, they would ignite fires throughout urban areas in a way that conventional bombing could never achieve. Military researchers spent extensive time studying bat behavior, hibernation patterns, and flight capabilities. They developed miniaturized incendiary devices that could be attached to the animals without interfering with their natural movements. The technology was surprisingly advanced, featuring timer mechanisms and chemical compounds that would produce intense, difficult-to-extinguish fires. Testing occurred at multiple secret facilities, with mixed but promising results. Some experiments demonstrated remarkable potential for widespread urban destruction. Researchers calculated that a single bomber carrying thousands of incendiary bats could start more fires across a wider area than conventional incendiary bombs. The psychological impact on enemy populations would be devastating, as fires would appear to start spontaneously throughout entire cities. the project consumed significant resources and involved extensive collaboration between military researchers, zoologists, and weapons specialists. Detailed studies were conducted on optimal release altitudes, seasonal timing, and methods for keeping bats alive during transport across the Pacific Ocean. However, the program was ultimately abandoned, not because of ethical concerns or practical limitations, but because the Manhattan Project showed greater promise for ending the war quickly. The development of atomic weapons made biological warfare experiments seem unnecessary by comparison. Documentation of Project X-ray remained classified for decades, not only because of its unusual nature, but because it represented a form of biological warfare that could have violated international conventions. The systematic use of animals as weapons raised ethical questions that military officials preferred to avoid addressing in public forums. The Nazi poison food experiments. Within the walls of Buchenwald concentration camp, Nazi physicians conducted systematic poison experiments that demonstrated the calculated nature of medical war crimes designed to advance military objectives. Between December 1943 and October 1944, researchers secretly administered various toxic substances to prisoners through their food to study the effects of different poisons on human subjects. These experiments were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned research programs designed to develop more effective methods of assassination and sabotage. Nazi scientists wanted to understand how different poisons affected the human body, how quickly they worked, and what symptoms they produced. This information would be valuable for intelligence operations, resistance suppression, and potential use against Allied personnel. The poisons were administered without the knowledge of the victims, who believed they were receiving their regular camp rations. Researchers carefully documented symptoms, progression of illness, and time until death. When subjects did not die quickly enough for complete observation, they were killed immediately to permit detailed autopsies. In September 1944, the experiments expanded to include testing poisonous bullets. Prisoners were shot with ammunition coated in various toxic substances, while researchers observed the combined effects of physical trauma and chemical poisoning. Subjects who survived the initial gunshot wounds were monitored until the poisons took effect. Additional experiments involved scrubbing or injecting poisonous substances directly into prisoners' skin. These tests caused severe boils filled with black fluid to form across victims' bodies. The progression of these lesions was photographed and documented in detail for later analysis. What makes these experiments particularly chilling is their systematic documentation. Nazi physicians maintained detailed records, photographs, and scientific reports treating human subjects as laboratory specimens. This comprehensive record-keeping served a dual purpose. It provided data for military applications while simultaneously classifying the crimes as legitimate medical research. The experiments were heavily photographed and documented because Nazi researchers intended to use the results for practical military applications. They were developing more effective methods for covert assassination, creating weapons that could poison enemy food supplies, and researching ways to make chemical agents more lethal in battlefield conditions. After the war, many of the physicians involved in these experiments attempted to justify their actions by claiming military necessity. They compared their victims to collateral damage from Allied bombing campaigns, arguing that wartime conditions made such research acceptable for national defense purposes. The systematic nature of this documentation reveals the calculated approach Nazi officials took toward concealing their crimes. By treating mass murder as scientific research, they created a framework for plausible deniability that would persist long after the war's end. Medical journals, research papers, and official reports transformed atrocities into academic studies, making it easier for Allied forces to classify the evidence and bury it within restricted archives. The Edgewood Arsenal Mind Control Program. For nearly 3 decades, from 1948 to 1975, the United States Army Chemical Corps conducted one of the most extensive and secretive human experimentation programs in military history. At the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland, over 7,000 American soldiers were systematically exposed to mind-altering drugs, nerve agents, and experimental chemicals without their informed consent or knowledge of the true nature of the testing. The official designation was the Medical Research Volunteer Program, but the volunteers had no understanding of what they were truly volunteering for. Soldiers were told they would be testing protective equipment, evaluating new uniforms, or participating in routine medical studies. In reality, they were becoming test subjects in a program designed to develop chemical weapons capable of disabling enemy forces and creating more effective interrogation techniques. The experiments involved exposure to over 250 different chemical compounds. LSD, PCP, marijuana, and other psychoactive substances were administered to determine their potential as battlefield weapons. Military researchers wanted to create artillery shells that could disperse powdered chemicals across enemy positions, leaving soldiers in comatose or hallucinogenic states for days at a time. One of the most disturbing aspects of the program was its deliberate targeting of minority soldiers. African American and Hispanic personnel were disproportionately selected for the most dangerous experiments, continuing the military's pattern of racial segregation in chemical testing that had begun during World War II. The testing protocols were designed to push subjects beyond their psychological and physical limits. Some soldiers were kept in isolated chambers for weeks while under the influence of experimental drugs. Others were subjected to sensory deprivation, extreme temperatures, and psychological torture while chemical agents affected their mental state. Medical staff monitored their reactions, but provided no treatment for adverse effects. Documentation from the program reveals that researchers were particularly interested in developing chemicals that could break down enemy resistance during interrogation. They tested combinations of drugs that would make subjects more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to reveal classified information, or unable to distinguish between reality and hallucination. The long-term health consequences for participants were deliberately ignored. No follow-up medical care was provided, and most test subjects never learned what chemicals had been used on them. When veterans later developed neurological disorders, cancers, or psychological problems, they had no way to connect their symptoms to their military service because all records of their participation had been classified or destroyed. The program's secrecy extended far beyond normal military classification. Participants were threatened with court-martial and imprisonment if they discussed their experiences. Medical records were altered or removed entirely. Even decades later, when some details began to emerge, the Department of Veterans Affairs refused to provide medical care for affected veterans because they could not prove their exposure to experimental chemicals. Project Shade. Naval experiments. The United States Navy conducted extensive chemical and biological warfare experiments on its own personnel through Project SHAD, the Shipboard Hazard and Defense Program. Between 1962 and 1974, hundreds of sailors were unknowingly exposed to nerve agents, biological weapons, and experimental chemicals during tests designed to evaluate decontamination procedures and protective equipment. The experiments took place aboard naval vessels in remote ocean locations, far from any possibility of civilian oversight or media attention. Ships were deliberately contaminated with sarin, VX nerve gas, and other deadly chemicals, while crew members went about their normal duties. Military researchers observed how the agents spread throughout the ships, how long they remained dangerous, and what effects they had on personnel. Sailors reported strange symptoms during and after these voyages: severe headaches, respiratory problems, skin irritation, and neurological issues that would persist for years. They had no knowledge that their ships had been used as floating laboratories for chemical weapons testing. When they sought medical treatment, military doctors provided no explanation for their symptoms and no record of potential chemical exposure. The biological warfare component of Project SHAD involved releasing bacteria and other microorganisms aboard ships to test how biological agents would spread in confined spaces. Researchers wanted to understand how enemy forces might use biological weapons against naval vessels and how effectively such attacks could be contained. One of the most disturbing aspects of the program was its use of live biological agents that could cause serious illness or death. Military researchers released bacteria that could cause pneumonia, skin infections, and other diseases among crew members. They justified this by claiming the organisms were harmless strains, but medical records suggest otherwise. The testing extended to port facilities and coastal areas where Navy personnel lived and worked. Communities near naval bases were unknowingly exposed to experimental chemicals and biological agents as researchers studied how these weapons might affect broader populations during wartime. When Project Shad was finally revealed in 2002, the Pentagon acknowledged that extensive testing had occurred, but claimed that most records had been destroyed or lost. Veterans who believed they had been affected by the experiments found it impossible to prove their exposure because documentation remained classified or had been deliberately eliminated. The Department of Veterans Affairs initially refused to provide medical care for Shad-related health problems, claiming that insufficient evidence existed to connect veterans' illnesses to their military service. This denial of care continued even after the Pentagon's official acknowledgement of the program, leaving many affected personnel without treatment for conditions that may have resulted from their unwilling participation in chemical and biological weapons testing. The Nazi hypothermia death experiments. At Dachau concentration camp, Nazi physicians conducted systematic hypothermia experiments that combined medical research with calculated torture designed to advance German military capabilities. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, needed data on how to treat pilots who had been shot down over cold water or frozen terrain. Rather than using ethical research methods, Nazi doctors chose to freeze human subjects to death while documenting every stage of the dying process. The experiments began in August 1942 under the direction of Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who had direct connections to Heinrich Himmler and the highest levels of SS leadership. Prisoners were selected from concentration camp populations and told they were participating in medical studies that would help German soldiers. They had no understanding that they were being chosen to die slowly from exposure to freezing temperatures, ING temperatures. Two primary methods were employed to freeze victims while Nazi physicians recorded detailed observations. The first involved placing naked prisoners in tanks filled with ice water at temperatures near freezing. Subjects were forced to remain submerged for hours while researchers monitored their vital signs, body temperature, and neurological responses. The water was kept at precisely controlled temperatures to ensure consistent data collection across multiple experiments. The second method exposed prisoners to outdoor conditions during winter months. Victims were stripped naked and left outside in sub-zero temperatures for extended periods. Some experiments continued for up to 14 hours in conditions reaching -6 degrees Celsius. Military observers took detailed notes on how quickly subjects lost consciousness, when their bodies stopped responding to stimuli, and the exact moment when death occurred. What made these experiments particularly systematic was the rewarming phase that followed. Nazi doctors wanted to understand not just how humans died from hypothermia, but also how they might be revived after extreme cold exposure. Some victims who had not yet died were subjected to various rewarming techniques: immersion in hot water, exposure to radiant heat, and even forced sexual contact with female prisoners. One witness later testified that some subjects were thrown directly into boiling water during rewarming attempts. The sudden temperature change caused additional trauma and often death, but researchers continued documenting the physiological responses. They measured how rapidly body temperature could be raised, what complications arose during rewarming, and which methods were most effective for revival. The data collected from these experiments was intended for immediate military application. German pilots and soldiers operating in cold climates would benefit from improved survival techniques and medical treatments. The research was considered so valuable that detailed reports were distributed to military medical units across the German armed forces. Between 360 and 400 separate experiments were conducted on approximately 300 victims. The precision of these numbers reveals the bureaucratic efficiency with which mass murder was disguised as medical research. Each experiment was carefully documented with photographs, temperature readings, and detailed descriptions of victim responses. The systematic nature of the documentation served multiple purposes beyond scientific record-keeping. By treating murder as research, Nazi officials created a framework for post-war justification. Medical journals and research papers transformed atrocities into academic studies, providing cover for war crimes and making it easier for Allied forces to classify the evidence within restricted archives. Operation Paperclip and the scientist extraction. In the chaotic final months of World War II, American intelligence agencies launched one of the most controversial and systematically concealed operations in military history. Operation Paperclip was designed to identify, capture, and relocate Nazi scientists to the United States before Soviet forces could acquire their expertise. What began as a limited program to secure advanced weapons technology evolved into a massive effort that ultimately brought over 1,600 German researchers to America. The operation required extensive coordination between military intelligence, the Office of Strategic Services, and scientific advisory committees. American teams raced across occupied Germany, following leads to research facilities, universities, and industrial sites where Nazi scientists were hiding or attempting to surrender to Western forces rather than Soviet troops. Among the most prized targets was Werner von Braun, the technical director of Nazi Germany's rocket program. Von Braun and his team had developed the V-2 ballistic missile, the world's first operational rocket capable of reaching space. Their expertise in rocket technology was considered essential for American military and space exploration programs. However, von Braun and many other recruited scientists had direct involvement in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The V-2 program relied heavily on slave labor from concentration camps, resulting in thousands of deaths among prisoners forced to work in underground factories. American officials were fully aware of these connections, but chose to overlook them in favor of acquiring advanced technology. The ethical complications of employing war criminals created serious problems for American policymakers. Public disclosure of the program would generate massive controversy and potentially damage America's moral standing in the post-war world. President Truman initially opposed bringing Nazi scientists to America, but military advisors convinced him that Soviet acquisition of German expertise posed a greater threat than the ethical concerns. To address these problems, American officials developed elaborate cover stories and falsified background documents for recruited scientists. War crimes records were destroyed or classified. Nazi party memberships were concealed or minimized. Scientists were presented to the American public as reluctant participants in Hitler's regime, who had been forced to work on military projects against their will. The program's secrecy extended far beyond normal intelligence classification. Participating scientists were given new identities, relocated to remote military facilities, and prohibited from discussing their wartime activities. Their families were brought to America under false pretenses, often told they were temporary visitors rather than permanent immigrants. The scientific achievements that resulted from Operation Paperclip were extraordinary. German rocket technology became the foundation for America's space program, leading directly to the Apollo moon missions. Jet engine development, submarine design, and numerous other military technologies were advanced by decades through the acquisition of Nazi research. However, the moral cost was equally significant. By prioritizing technological advancement over justice for war crimes, American officials established a precedent for overlooking atrocities in favor of strategic advantage. The program demonstrated that scientific knowledge could provide immunity from prosecution for even the most serious crimes against humanity. The full scope of Operation Paperclip remained classified for decades. Details emerged slowly through Freedom of Information Act requests, congressional investigations, and journalistic research. Even today, significant portions of the program's documentation remain classified, suggesting that additional controversial aspects have yet to be revealed. The Japanese Unit 731 Biological Warfare Program. In occupied Manchuria, the Imperial Japanese Army operated the most extensive biological warfare research program in human history. Unit 731, officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, conducted systematic experiments on human subjects that combined medical research with weapons development on an industrial scale. The facility covered 6 square kilometers and employed over 3,000 researchers, technicians, and support staff. It included laboratories, testing facilities, breeding areas for disease vectors, and production facilities capable of manufacturing biological weapons in massive quantities. The scope and sophistication of the operation exceeded anything attempted by Nazi Germany or any other combatant nation. Under the direction of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted experiments involving anthrax, plague, cholera, typhoid, and numerous other deadly diseases. Prisoners referred to as logs were infected with various pathogens, while researchers documented the progression of disease, tested potential treatments, and evaluated the effectiveness of different biological agents as weapons. The experiments extended far beyond simple disease infection. Prisoners were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, had limbs amputated to study blood loss, were exposed to extreme temperatures and pressures, and underwent surgical procedures designed to test human endurance limits. Women were infected with syphilis and then forced to become pregnant to study how diseases affected fetal development. What made Unit 731 particularly dangerous was its focus on weapons delivery systems. Researchers developed bombs designed to disperse biological agents over wide areas, tested methods for contaminating water supplies, and created artillery shells filled with disease-carrying insects. These weapons were tested on prisoner populations and in field trials against Chinese civilians. The program's most disturbing aspect was its systematic approach to human experimentation. Each test was carefully designed to produce specific data that could be applied to biological weapons development. Prisoners were categorized by age, gender, and physical condition to ensure consistent experimental conditions across multiple trials. American intelligence agencies learned about Unit 731 during the final months of the war, but chose to conceal its existence rather than prosecute those responsible. The biological warfare data collected through human experimentation was considered too valuable to lose through war crimes trials. General Douglas MacArthur granted immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research findings. This decision had profound consequences for post-war justice and international law. By prioritizing scientific knowledge over accountability for mass murder, American officials established a precedent that would influence Cold War military research for decades. The biological weapons data acquired from Japanese experiments became the foundation for American biological warfare programs during the 1950s and 1960s. The cover-up of Unit 731 was so complete that its existence remained largely unknown for over 30 years. Japanese officials destroyed most documentation before surrendering, while American intelligence agencies classified their own records of the program. When details finally emerged, they revealed the extent to which both Japanese and American authorities had collaborated to conceal evidence of systematic human experimentation. The Nazi Ahnenerbe archaeological expeditions. Heinrich Himmler's Ahnenerbe, officially known as the Research and Teaching Society for Ancestral Heritage, conducted archaeological and anthropological expeditions that combined pseudo-scientific research with intelligence-gathering operations across the globe. These expeditions were presented as academic research but served as cover for military reconnaissance, resource evaluation, and the development of unconventional weapons systems. The organization employed legitimate archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, alongside SS officers and intelligence operatives. Their missions took them to Tibet, the Middle East, South America, and remote regions of Europe in search of ancient knowledge that could be applied to modern military purposes. One of the most extensive operations was the 1938 Tibet expedition led by Ernst Schaefer. Officially described as a zoological and anthropological research mission, the expedition included extensive photography of strategic locations, mapping of potential military routes, and evaluation of Tibet's mineral resources. The team also investigated local religious practices and ancient texts, seeking knowledge that could be applied to psychological warfare and mind control research. The Ahnenerbe's Middle Eastern operations focused on archaeological sites in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. These expeditions were designed to locate ancient texts and artifacts that might contain advanced technological knowledge. SS researchers believed that ancient civilizations possessed scientific understanding that had been lost over time and could be recovered through systematic archaeological investigation. In South America, Ahnenerbe teams investigated reports of advanced pre-Columbian civilizations and unusual archaeological sites. These expeditions combined genuine archaeological work with intelligence gathering about strategic resources, potential military bases, and indigenous populations that could be exploited during wartime. The organization's European operations included extensive excavation of Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic archaeological sites. These digs were used to support Nazi racial theories, while simultaneously searching for ancient technologies and weapons that could be adapted for modern use. What made the Ahnenerbe particularly dangerous was its integration of legitimate academic research with military intelligence operations. Participating scholars provided scientific credibility for expeditions that were actually conducting reconnaissance for future military operations. Archaeological sites became cover for evaluating strategic locations and resources. The organization also conducted extensive research into ancient texts and religious practices, seeking methods for psychological manipulation and mind control. SS researchers studied meditation techniques, religious ceremonies, and traditional healing practices, looking for approaches that could be weaponized for interrogation and population control. After the war, most Ahnenerbe documentation was destroyed or classified by Allied intelligence agencies. The combination of legitimate archaeological research with military intelligence made it difficult to distinguish between academic work and espionage activities. Many participating scholars were quietly relocated to Allied research programs rather than prosecuted for their involvement in intelligence operations. The true scope of Ahnenerbe activities remained largely concealed for decades. Expeditions that appeared to be academic research were revealed to have collected extensive military intelligence about strategic locations around the world. Archaeological excavations had been used to evaluate sites for potential military bases, resource extraction, and weapons testing facilities. The Bell Project and temporal manipulation research. In the depths of Lower Silesia, within a facility so secret that even high-ranking SS officers spoke of it only in whispers, Nazi scientists conducted experiments that may have touched the very fabric of reality itself. Die Glocke, known simply as the Bell, represented the culmination of the Third Reich's most ambitious and terrifying research program. What emerged from those underground laboratories challenged everything scientists thought they understood about physics, time, and the nature of existence. The device itself defied conventional engineering. Standing 9 feet tall and 5 feet in diameter, the Bell was constructed from an unknown metallic alloy that has never been successfully reproduced by modern metallurgy. Its surface was perfectly smooth, almost mirror-like, and appeared to absorb light in ways that hurt the eyes to observe directly. The entire apparatus was suspended by massive chains within a concrete chamber lined with ceramic tiles and copper conductors. At the heart of the Bell's operation were 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a mysterious substance designated only as Zerum 525. This material, described as having the consistency of mercury but exhibiting properties unlike any known element, was the key to the device's impossible capabilities. When the cylinders began spinning in opposite directions and electrical current was applied, reality itself seemed to bend around the apparatus. The effects produced by the bell's activation were beyond anything in conventional physics. Electrical systems throughout the facility would fail without explanation. Organic matter near the device underwent rapid cellular breakdown, with plant life withering and dying within minutes of exposure. Most disturbing were reports of gravitational anomalies that caused objects to move in impossible directions and light itself to bend around the operating chamber. Workers assigned to the Bell project died in ways that defied medical explanation. Some were found completely desiccated, their bodies mummified as if they had been dead for decades rather than hours. Others suffered from a condition that turned their blood into a jelly-like substance, killing them slowly over the course of days while they remained conscious and aware. According to interrogation records obtained from SS General Jacob Sporenberg before his execution, the Bell was part of a larger program aimed at mastering anti-gravity propulsion and achieving what Nazi scientists called chronological manipulation. These claims, initially dismissed as desperate fantasy from a condemned war criminal, gained credibility decades later when classified documents surfaced describing temporal displacement experiments and field distortion research. The theoretical foundation for the Bell's operation involved concepts that wouldn't appear in mainstream physics for another 30 years. Nazi researchers had somehow developed an understanding of quantum mechanics, electromagnetic field manipulation, and space-time geometry that surpassed anything available to Allied scientists. Their work suggested they had discovered methods for altering the flow of time itself. Stone platforms discovered near the facility bore runic inscriptions and electromagnetic scoring patterns that indicated the Bell had been tested in multiple configurations. These platforms, dubbed the Henge by researchers who discovered them decades later, showed evidence of intense electromagnetic exposure and what appeared to be temporal distortion effects frozen in the stone itself. These 10 projects represent more than historical curiosities or wartime atrocities. They reveal a systematic pattern of suppression that continues to this day. Each program was buried not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways that threatened existing power structures. The silence surrounding these discoveries tells us that some knowledge is considered too dangerous for humanity to possess. The question is not whether these technologies existed, but why we have been denied access to breakthroughs that could have transformed medicine, energy, and human potential itself. What other secrets remain locked away in classified vaults, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light?